welcome to everyone joining us today. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really pleased that we are able to offer this webinar today, the day before the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is Senior Fellow and Director of our program on Society, Culture, and Politics, for taking the lead and spearheading this initiative. We have excellent speakers to shed light on the Federal Republic of Germany as it hits the 75-year mark. And I look forward now to turning things over to Eric and to sitting back and hearing the views and appreciating the discussion. So Eric, over to you, and I will sit in rapt attention.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome to all of the viewers of this webinar. So tomorrow, as Jeff mentioned, will be the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. If we think back to 1945, when we think back to the late 1940s, and then the foundation of the Federal Republic in 1949, I think that it's pretty clear that the outlooks for the country were rather bleak, given the instability of modern German history, given Germany's role in perpetrating both world wars as well as heinous crimes against humanity epitomized by the Holocaust. But a couple of decades later, a different narrative had taken hold, narrative of success. And I think people were, for decades, shaking their heads that a country that looked like it was going nowhere was able to rebuild itself, was able to rehabilitate itself from both a moral and a political perspective to become the rather successful country that it is today. This is not to say that there weren't periods of tension. They always existed. We shouldn't forget the tensions with the competing communist regime in the German Democratic Republic. We shouldn't forget domestic protest in the 60s and the 70s, the challenges after reunification in 1990 onwards, and then, of course, most recently with the rise of right-wing populism and geopolitical challenges. So we have three really senior and amazing historians who will share their reflections on different aspects of the history of the Federal Republic, how it has gotten to where it is today. So our first speaker will be Dr. Helmut Walser-Smith, who's the Martha Rivers Ingram Professor of History at Vanderbilt University and currently an NEH Fellow at the Center for Jewish History in New York. His books have appeared in numerous languages and are on the history of German nationalism, religious conflict, the modern implications of German history for today. And his current research is looking at post-Holocaust memory culture of small towns and villages in Germany. Then we will have Anna von der Goltz, who's a professor of German and European history at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on the political and cultural history of 20th century Germany. Her first book was on Hindenburg and actually won the Wiener Library's Frankel Prize in Contemporary History in 2008. Her second book is entitled The Other 68ers, Student Protest and Christian Democracy in West Germany, which came out in 2021. And she's currently working on a history of political conversions in the 20th century. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Konrad H. Jarausch, who's the Lurcy Professor of European Civilization at the University of North Carolina and the past director of the Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam. He's a prize-winning author and editor of about 50 books on German and European history. His latest volumes include Broken Lives, How Ordinary Germans Experienced the 20th Century, and Embattled Europe, a Progressive Alternative. So we will start with Dr. Walser-Smith. Each of our speakers will present for about 7 to 10 minutes. Then we will transition to a question and answer format. I would ask anybody who would like to ask a question to type it into the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of Zoom, and then I can curate, I can amalgamate questions, etc. So without further ado, Helmut, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm very pleased and, in fact, honored to be here. The Federal Republic of Germany was the longest living German nation state is the longest living German nation state in the history of modern democratic politics, dated from 1789. The point bears emphasizing. In the 1980s, when I was a student, a professor still gave lectures entitled Bonn is not, which was then the capital of the Federal Republic. Some younger people might not know. Bonn is not Weimar. That was the title of their lecture. These professors still believed that this was a point that needed to be made. Perhaps it still does. 4 years ago, prior to January 6, 2021, a journalist for a very respected newspaper expressed astonishment at my opinion that the United States was far more likely than Germany to fall prey to an undemocratic coup, and that the United States, far more than Germany, constituted a rickety constitutional democratic state. I would like to confine my remarks about the Federal Republic to its early decades, and especially the domestic side of its affairs, understanding that all of this has a larger European and Cold War context. How to constitute a country or a nation after so much shame and devastation, loss of life, and killing? The answer in the Federal Republic was not yet Europe, it was not yet cosmopolitanism. It is of enormous significance that the Federal Republic was constituted in an era of what historians and economists call deglobalization, one that stretched from about 1914 to circa 1970. That it was initially the most homogeneous German polity that had ever existed, at least in ethnic terms, with non-Germans counting about 1% of the population by 1949. That it was a place where few of its people had ever been abroad except in military capacities. And that it was a place where nation thinking was not only quite natural in Germany, but also everywhere else. When we think about the United Nations, first of all, it is not the United Societies, it is the United Nations. And moreover, in the next 2 decades, the number of actual nations would come close to tripling. In other words, in this early period, the world was awash in new nations. Almost all of them fought for their independence, argued for their independence using the language of anti-colonialism, but also the language of nationalism. Nationalism was still the natural language of citizens almost everywhere. This was a language in Germany that still saw sacrifice, or Opferbereitschaft, as mercury to measure the worth of especially male citizens. It was a language that still appealed to national solidarity, in fact, in the last war, and still talked about treason. One remembers that in the early 60s, the Bavarian politician Franz Josef Strauss could still call out Willy Brandt, who had been in exile in Sweden, by rhetorically asking, "Where were you in those 12 years?" and adding, "We know where we were." What the historian Michael Howard called the invention of peace was by no means yet on the horizon. The early Federal Republic was still engulfed in war, in its continued possibilities, and in its after effects. It was a country, one walked around it, of crippled men. It was a country of men, especially men with PTSD. And it was a country in which millions of women had been raped. It was full of families, especially from the East, who had lost everything. And it was full of people, whether they admitted to it or not, who had committed crimes, war crimes, crimes against Jews and others. It was also a place that was continually reminded of war, with the Berlin airlift of 1949. And it can also be recalled in this context that probably the most divisive political issue of the 1950s in Germany was the debate about rearmament. Then, too, Germans by no means across the board thought that the nationalism that fueled the Nazis was in some basic sense illegitimate. In the post-war era, many, if not most, remembered in the immediate post-war era, sorry about that. In the 1950s, many, if not most, remembered 1933 to 1939 fondly, so the pre-war Nazi era. In questionnaires, a majority of Germans still assented to the sentence, had it not been for the war, Hitler would have been seen as one of Germany's greatest statesmen. In few of these questionnaires do we find nostalgia for the democratic Weimar Republic. And about 90% of the population still assented to the idea that Jews constituted a different race from Germans. The real challenge, I would say, faced by the early Republic was how to reform or reshape nationalism, or as it was now more, that is to say in the 50s, more often called patriotism. How, as Dolf Sternberger put it, to form a, quote, living, not a dying concept of fatherland. Some in the audience may also know that Sternberger was the intellectual who coined the German term Verfassungspatriotismus, or constitutional patriotism. In the end, there were three roads away from this kind of Nazi-tinged nationalism of the early years of the founding of the Federal Republic. One could say that Europe was a fourth, but I chose here to blend out the wider diplomatic and international aspects of the problems. One road involved leaving behind the values of the warfare state and embracing those of the welfare state. In this, Germany was helped immensely by the Wirtschaftswunder. Already by the late 50s, most Germans thought that the time they lived in, 1959, for example, 1960, the time they lived in was actually better than the period 1933 to 1939. That was especially true among younger people. A second road led out of deglobalization. This was the road of increased travel, of capitalist exchange, and the shift, especially impressive after 1961, when the Berlin Wall put a stop to East German workers coming into West Germany, and therefore allowing essentially the West German economic miracle to shore up its labor shortage with other ethnic Germans. Instead, foreigners, so-called guest workers, now began to come in greater number, many of whom would later stay, and paving the way for the road for the Federal Republic of Germany and then a united Germany to become an immigrant nation, which it has become in an important way. The third road was to embrace the Constitution or the basic laws, whose first article, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, or the dignity of man is untouchable, or the worth of man is untouchable, evokes the Declaration of American independence and its language of inalienable rights, and so signals a Western drift of German constitutional thinking. It also, however, evokes Immanuel Kant, who posited, one might say, posited three stages of statehood. The state that uses men, by which he means people, as mere means. The state that uses men and people as both means and ends. And then finally, a state that primarily sees the welfare of its citizens and the protection of their rights and dignity as its end. In the post-genocide early Federal Republic, we may also read the language of inalienable rights or untouchable dignity or worth of humans, people, in the sense of Adorno's reformulation of Kant, as thinking and acting in such a way as to ensure that Auschwitz or something like it never repeats itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next up, we'll hear from Dr. von der Goltz.
Thank you so much, Eric and colleagues, for having us today. I'm very pleased to be here in this illustrious company. And our brief today was, of course, to explain the unprecedented success of the Federal Republic, which, as Helmut alluded to, is really remarkable for its longevity. It's the political system that's now lasted longer than the Kaiserreich, the Weimar Republic, and the Nazi years combined. I'll more or less stick to the brief that we were given, but in doing so I'll be a little bit of a contrarian. And I want to make 2 points, both of them conceptual or historiographical. The first is that despite its longevity, there are actually good reasons to question the success of the Federal Republic, or at least to aim for more nuanced readings of its history that don't just seek to explain its achievements, but that also account for its lingering problems. And the second is that something important is actually missing when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Federal Republic's founding in isolation from the founding of its socialist neighbor to the east, the German Democratic Republic, which of course took place in 1949 as well. We cannot fully understand the internal dynamics of the Federal Republic without acknowledging that it was one half of a divided country. Let me say a bit more about the first, questioning the success narrative. For a long time, the Federal Republic's success was indeed the central trope of most histories. Major surveys presented its history as a remarkable democratic success story, a kind of Sonderweg in reverse that rid the country of its authoritarian residues after 1945. This was in some ways the German version of the end of history, if you will. And it was the central premise of most of the master narratives that German historians produced from the 1980s onwards, really into the 2000s, which introduced a number of quite closely related paradigms that charted the internal transformation of the Federal Republic, be they liberalization, Americanization, Westernization, or re-civilization. Even moments when the political system was fiercely contested and there was sort of a political crisis, even these moments were integrated into these master narratives. The political and cultural revolt of 1968, on which I've worked quite extensively, is one such example. It was initially often interpreted as the second founding of the Federal Republic, as the moment when a sort of formally democratic society that was still deeply authoritarian at its core turned an order that was imposed from the outside, or filled an order that was imposed from the outside with democratic life from below. Cultural democratization was a catchword for this. Such readings have been questioned in recent years, and I think rightly so. Historians have pointed out that they indeed offer quite a sanitized version of the history of 1968, and in some ways misunderstand some of the central goals of the protagonists, which weren't so much to internally liberalize the Federal Republic, but quite often actually envisaged a revolutionary overthrow of the system, and who also conceived of their politics in far more global terms than domestic ones. More generally, and I think more importantly for our purposes today, historians have increasingly begun to question the overall premise of the success narrative as a frame for writing the history of the Federal Republic. And I think in our current moment, there are plenty of reasons for doing so. The right-wing AfD is on the cusp of becoming the strongest party in a number of East German states. In the wake of the murderous rampage of the National Socialist Underground, or more recently, the racist mass murder in Hanau, I think this is a moment when the darker aspects of German history that have continued to linger into the present have moved more fully into view. There's a whole host of important new research projects currently underway, for instance, that examines the long ignored history of right-wing extremism in the Federal Republic. And I think in other ways too, it's become clear that many of Germany's current political problems, be they a lack of childcare, an issue that of course shapes the lives of children, their educational opportunities, the lives of parents, but that also has major labor market implications, or the country's dependence on Russian gas until very recently, that these issues actually have their roots in the Cold War era Federal Republic. So many newer histories therefore treat the process of Germany's transformation after 1945 not so much as a linear evolution, as a march towards success, as it were, but as a far more winding and contested path, and as one that was not just optimistic and forward-looking, but actually driven by persistent and often existential fears about the fragility of democracy in Germany. One could perhaps even argue that moving beyond the success narrative and writing the history of the Federal Republic is actually essential to safeguarding its future by increasing democratic vigilance. Now to my second point, that we cannot fully understand the Federal Republic without taking into account the GDR's existence. Now, just because the GDR no longer exists, it doesn't mean that it has no impact on the present, or that it was a mere footnote in German history. It mattered most, of course, for the people who lived through 4 decades of socialist rule, but it also gave the Federal Republic its peculiar character. East Germany as the ever-present other, as Eric Weitz memorably put it, shaped West German politics and society from the outset, particularly its strong anti-communist consensus, which emerged as the country's integrating ideology in the 1950s, and which shaped discourses and policy in numerous areas. In fact, the Federal Republic derived many of its chief characteristics in reverse image from the GDR. Neither its welfare state nor its social conservatism in the realms of family and gender policy, which really distinguished the Federal Republic from the US and from comparable Western European countries, would have looked the same without the existence of its socialist neighbor. The GDR was, to quote Donna Harsh, the devil in a red dress, the anti-model that influenced not just rhetoric, but policy in West Germany. So the West German stay-at-home mother, who later worked part-time at best, was the antidote to the East German working mother. And this is a history that continues to shape debates on gender and family policy into the present. And I think given this impact, I think it's quite surprising and in some ways perhaps quite limiting that we are seeing a host of conferences around this 75th anniversary of the Federal Republic's founding. And I'm thinking of one I attended in Princeton last year and of a recent workshop in Tübingen, for instance, that entirely exclude the history of the GDR from consideration. And I think that the recent commercial success of books on East Germany by authors like Katja Heuer and Dirk Oschmann, which don't necessarily offer much that's new to the experts, but which highlight the distinctiveness and diversity of East German experiences for a general audience, that this success shows that there is a larger public desire, especially among East Germans, to see this history represented in conversations about the present state of the country and its politics. In short, when we commemorate the Federal Republic's founding, and when we try to understand its internal dynamics, the GDR deserves a role, and not just as a negative foil to highlight the West's achievements. I'll leave it at that, and I hope that I've provided a decent seg to Konrad Jarausch, who has, of course, done much to illuminate many of the issues that I've just talked about. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. All right, Konrad, it's your turn.
Okay, I will not focus so much on the success or failure of the Federal Republic, but rather on the question of constitution, because that's the anniversary that we are dealing with. And actually, the Cold War division of Germany had two competing constitutions, which claimed to be speaking for the entire country, but instead assumed a life of their own. The East Germans that we've just heard about actually had three constitutions that changed from a national to a Soviet, pro-Soviet and Marxist-Leninist constitution. The Federal Republic, of course, had what is known as the Basic Law, which was a tentative attempt to learn from Weimar and to keep the door to unification open. These two competing and contrary traditions and social systems had to be reconciled when the two Germanys were ready to unite. And what I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes is how the process took place and what kind of new country emerged from the transition. Initially, the peaceful revolution aimed at restoring real democracy in East Germany, not just in rhetorical sense, when the mass exodus of 1989 turned into human rights protests according to the slogan, "We are the people." The popular demands for reform in the GDR focused on defensive human rights of free speech, association, and assembly of the Western kind of character. And the new public space for resumption of free expression focused on an end of the Marxist dictatorship or the welfare dictatorship, in which the West German system largely served as a template. The first revisions of the East German constitution abolished the leading role of the Socialist Unity Party, allowed joint ventures, rejected the Stalinist National Front, and restored functioning labor unions. So you have a kind of an attempt to go in a Western direction. The purpose of these changes was to allow the population to express its wishes through free election in order to choose their future. Eventually, of course, this created space for the unification story. In the beginning, the reformist elements of the Socialist Unity Party and the opposition spokespeople aimed at what some of us have called a third way between socialism and capitalism in order to benefit from Western prosperity and Eastern welfare provisions. The new GDR constitution, drafted by the Central Roundtable, accepted the basic thrust of the Grundgesetz, but went beyond it, calling for more social rights, plebiscitary elements, and things like the right to abortion, environmental protection, and gender equality, some of which would have required changes in the West as well. However, the draft was largely ignored in practice since the first free election of the GDR on March 18, 1990, led to a resounding victory of the unification supporters. The new GDR Parliament of the Volkskammer therefore issued a raft of regulations and statutes to create a conceptual bridge between the Stalinist East German constitution and the imported Western Basic Law. Instead of creating a new constitution for an independent country, these legislative changes led to preparation for East Germany merging with the larger Federal Republic. Now, the constitutional process of this unification used Article 23 of the Basic Law in order to allow what was considered a bankrupt GDR to accede to what was considered a flourishing Federal Republic. Of course, as Anna just pointed out, these are exaggerations on either side. The technique went considerably beyond initial discussions of a treaty community or confederation that would have preserved an independent GDR. At the same time, it also rejected Article 146, which envisaged the creation of a completely new constitution to be ratified by popular vote of the entire country, because that seemed too risky for the Western conservatives in the core government. Recognizing Western success, Article 23 preserved the economic, social, and legal structures of the Federal Republic and extended what was considered the blessings of the West to the East, but it did not sufficiently take into account that the GDR had 4 decades of different development behind it. This method of unification reassured Western continuity, but missed the chance to create an entirely new social vision for the country that would have combined the experience of both parts. Therefore, this procedure made integration of the East ultimately more difficult. The enormous practical challenges of merging real existing socialism into the market economy required a series of treaties with quasi-constitutional force. The first was the State Treaty on the Currency, Economic, and Social Union, which governed the socio-economic transformation of the GDR and the introduction of the D-Mark desired by the population. But the excessive high exchange rate of almost 2-to-1 created an economic shock that destroyed much East German industry, created huge unemployment. A second step was the Unification Treaty that spelled out the concrete fashion of the adjustment and actual transition, according to the conservative precepts of the West German CDU. This lengthy document contained numerous exceptions for the transition period and specified some amendments to the Basic Law. A third effort was the reconstitution of the Länder to fit the unitary GDR into the federal system of the West by reviving the 5 post-war states of the East and merging the 2 halves of Berlin. The state constitutions retained more GDR heritage by stressing gender equality and environmental protection. And the final aspect was also the foreign policy settlement of the 2+4 treaty, which accepted the post-war borders and gave East Germany immediate EU membership and allowed it to join NATO as well. This aspect reassured neighboring countries that Germany would continue to be embedded in international agreements. The result was not a merger of equals, but rather the accession of the discredited East to what was considered or claiming to be the successful West. For 2 years, the liberal abortion ruling was allowed to differ, and after the initial Similarly, the initial expropriations of the Bodenreform during Soviet occupation were allowed to stand, as were farming cooperatives that were permitted to continue during the rapid trusteeship privatization. And finally, the intense controversy of the files of the East German security system called Stasi were preserved. In other areas such as public service, higher education, and the legal system, Western patterns were introduced in spite of considerable resistance and subsequent unemployment. Much personnel was dismissed. This de facto incorporation into the West created a great challenge for the East German population, which had to forget their prior experience and learn new rules in order to cope with the Western system. On October 2nd, the East Germans went to bed, and the next day they woke up in a different country without having moved away. Unification through Article 23 had the advantage of providing quick westernization in a political, material, and psychological sense that responded to East German desires for access to the consumer society temptations. Through joining a proven constitution, the immensely complicated process of transition allowed East German citizens rapid participation in Western politics, economics, and society. However, this conservative version of national unity ignored, as I said, different Eastern experiences and welfare advances which might also have benefited the West. Therefore, it was a missed opportunity for German modernization in areas in which the GDR had proven more innovative, such as gender equality and childcare. As a result of ignoring Eastern experiences, the subsequent process of integration became more difficult, and a certain nostalgia developed for a warmth of East German society which disregarded the dictatorial nature of the SED regime. Ironically, it took the renewed impetus of the Red-Green coalition and court decisions to resume reform efforts and achieve a balance between Western tradition and social modernity. The new Germany, which arose out of the conservative form of unification, was nonetheless a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous state. As a result of the Nazi crimes and the lost war, the country was territorially reduced by having to accept the loss of its eastern provinces. But thanks to the Basic Law, the politics of United Germany remained a stable democracy in which the new Eastern citizens could reject the legacy of the double dictatorships and gradually learn self-government. Although the East Germans faced enormous dislocations by being thrust into a liberal democratic system, their response to the socioeconomic shock treatment was facilitated by huge financial transfers from the West, which privileged the German post-communist transition compared with the adjustment problems of their neighbors. Moreover, the accession to the Federal Republic also immediately opened the door to European integration instead of having to wait for admission to the EU like the neighbors. Thereby, the new federal states and the entire country moved from the border of the Cold War to the center of a coalescing continent. For the first time in its history, Germany was now, as they say, surrounded by friends. This positive outcome raises the question, posed recently by Markus Meckel and Bodo Ramelow, should Article 146 now be eliminated and the Grundgesetz be accepted as permanent constitution for Germany?
All right, thank you very much to all three of you. I would like to encourage our viewers to type their questions into the Q&A function. I see that we already have a couple of them in there, but I would like to assert my right as the moderator to perhaps ask the first question. So first of all, thank you to all three of you for really, really good insights into the history, the 75-year history of the Federal Republic. One of the biggest takeaways for me, and I think each of you made this point to one extent or another, is that this linear success narrative, the Sonderweg in reverse, as Anna put it, needs to be more nuanced. And it wasn't a linear process. As Anna also put it, the dark shadows of German history are a thread throughout these 75 years, rearing their ugly face more recently. But I wonder, Konrad, it seems that you were supporting this point that unification was a lost opportunity. And so I'm wondering, were there other lost opportunities, either in the late 40s or the early 50s? Was 68, I mean, Anna is the expert on 68, but I also get the sense that our, heroic understanding of 68 also needs to be kind of contextualized a little bit, that maybe it didn't achieve as much as it did. So were there other kind of lost opportunities? And then related to that, we didn't talk that much about the international dimension, but I'm thinking especially of the moment of unification. I'm not sure that things could have been otherwise, given the short window that was actually there with support from all of Germany's occupying powers, as well as the understandable fears of Germany's neighbors if things didn't turn out quickly and maybe the way that it did. So I guess a two-part question: were there lost opportunities, and what about the international dimension constraining these kind of critical junctures?
Would you like me to answer?
Please.
Okay. Well, there were a whole lot of missed opportunities. After all, as Helmut has pointed out, there was a great degree of post-fascist shaping of the early Federal Republic, and it's actually ironic in many ways that the GDR had a more progressive outlook early, and that the Federal Republic had more of the shadow of the Nazi past in it. And the challenge would therefore for historians be to explain this reversal and to figure out to what degree the reversal really took place, how post-fascist was the GDR, and how democratic was the Federal Republic. And there was lots of political confrontation and contestation and so on. And it took, after the lengthy Adenauer period and then Erhard and so on, for Willy Brandt and Social Democrats to have a shot at it. So we have, I think, successive attempts, and then the younger generation beyond the Social Democrats, so that we can point at different places to moments when development might have gone differently. And I think my sense of it is that the success story is, of course, simple-minded, and especially the version that already has everything decided by the time Adenauer manages to get himself elected as chancellor, and the Kanzlerdemokratie that develops therefrom. It is a dirty process, it's a long process, it's an incomplete process, and I think that is what is fascinating us.
Anna and Helmut, would you like to take a stab at that question?
Maybe briefly on 68 as a missed opportunity. I think with regards to the state response, there's sort of two versions of an answer. One is that the SPD's sort of hardline policy in the 1970s actually further alienated young leftists, drove them away from kind of mainstream parties, particularly from the SPD, arguably contributed to sort of further radicalization and so forth. And then there's another version that says that the SPD's hardline response actually helped to convince centrist voters, and including Christian Democrats even, of their patriotism, as it were, that it's the response to Schleier's kidnapping and the kind of hardline, the hardline response there actually showed that militant democracy worked in practice. And so, one can sort of play it both ways in a way. I think this idea of missed opportunities is always an interesting intellectual exercise. It's very hard to prove in practice what is true. I mean, I think both of those arguments have some something to them. And it's been interesting to see that this concept, I think, of militant democracy has made such a comeback and is now on everyone's lips again, as often as a positive reference point, when certainly in the scholarship, it's viewed much more critically, because for a long time it was associated so much with the clampdown on left-wing dissent, as it were, and the ban on radicals, which I think overall is viewed very critically, rightly so, in the literature.
If I could just add what is no doubt an idiosyncratic view about turning points. I think one of the turning points we really don't discuss enough is right around 1959, 1960, 1961. A number of things came together at that period. There was this campaign of graffiti in which literally hundreds of places and monuments and all of this were young kids, mainly young kids, put graffiti, Nazi graffiti all over the place, in hundreds of towns. And there was a real reaction to this, and a lot of public people in cities and towns spoke up. It was the time of the really going with chasing Nazi criminals. Obviously, this is part of the frame of the Eichmann trials. But there was a moment, 59, 60, 61, that I think is often overlooked, that could have engendered a more honest and early look at the past. Instead, what happened was a highly politicized confrontation with the past. And I think that Ulrich Herbert was not entirely wrong to call this period of the late 60s and into the 70s a kind of, he called it a second repression, a zweite Verdrängung. And I think that there were interesting early moments when this story might have turned out differently, and the whole question of Germany's dealing with the past, which is now seen as a success story, but for a long time was an up and down story. And so just my 2 cents of turning points. Sure, I think that there are many, and many that we don't really even think about so much anymore.
All right, well, we have quite a few questions in the Q&A function. Maybe I'll start with a question from Jennifer Evans. She's interested in how you square different scales in your own writing between the national/structural and the perspectival, and the different timelines and turning points that are encountered when we come at this history from these different angles. Anybody like to just take a stab at that? Konrad?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of historians have for a long time done sort of a political narrative of the Federal Republic and an economic narrative and so on. But I think what with everyday history and looking from below has become part of the focus as well is how individuals were involved in all of these things. And I think there is a kind of frame overall, but then there's also a question of what happens. How did individuals, ordinary people and so on, be involved in all of these things? And how were their lives shaped by that? And I think that is a kind of challenge to deal with that tension. And I think both of the other panelists have written fascinating books that do this.
Anna or Helmut? Helmut?
Oh, did you want to go first, Anna?
No, I think it's the only one on this panel who hasn't written a survey. I'll let you go first. I've got a few thoughts, but I want to hear you first, Helmut.
So I think this is a really interesting question. I think it's a very difficult question. I think it's a kind of question that ultimately gets solved in writing, and not with a schema beforehand. But it does open to me the issue, and Anna also talked about this in her talk about this question: do we see it as a success story, or do we not see it as a success story? And I think that it's this, both the criticism and the original success story historiography put us in a kind of the straitjacket of a false dichotomy, not a false a dichotomy that's, it's not false, a dichotomy that is a little bit too stringent for my taste. But I don't understand why, to use Jennifer's, terminology of scales, I don't understand why we can't see some parts of what happened in the Federal Republic as a genuine success story. Not for the whole period. And let me just take memory culture here, because it's where my head is. You could say that until circa 1980s, it's not very much of a success story. It has its moments, but overall, before, let's say by 1975, you could say, what is that? That's 26 years into the Federal Republic. You could say not much has happened, and that's quite a problem. And you would be right to narrate it like this. But then something does happen by 1979, 1980. And there is a sort of, we don't have to go into all the factors that came into play here, but there is a kind of explosion. And I teach a class in my graduate program about how nations deal with its past, a comparative class, and especially its dark and difficult past. It's the past of slavery, the past of other genocides, and so on. And what's very clear is that a lot of memory workers in Guatemala or other places actually look to the Federal Republic. When they want to see how this moves, this, much more than the United States, this is a place they look to. And so I think that it's important to also say that. I think it's important to weave this story in such a way that it also has its successes. I mean, this is really the first polity in the history of Germany that is A, around so long, and B, genuinely democratic, with the real challenges, especially from the AfD at the moment, that democratic polities have. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think we may be at a point where the success narrative has now been questioned quite a bit. And we almost, as you just did, Helmut, have to make the point that, maybe there was actually some success at some point. But I do think the original enterprise, I mean, I think that the sort of version of this history with success as an overall framing device that popped up in all these subtitles of these books and so forth, it was really important to point out that that's not the entire story. And that's sort of where I sympathize. But I also think that as soon as you zoom out, and this happens to me in lectures, the same happened to me when I was trying to make the point about Weimar history, that, Weimar wasn't doomed to failure from the start. It's sort of easy to make that when you look at specific issues and parties and moments, but as sort of an overall narrative of Weimar history, it's then very difficult to also explain why the Nazis came to power. And I think the same with the Federal Republic's success. If you sort of pick at it too much, you've still got to find some way of explaining why we're still here 75 years later, and why memory workers in Guatemala think that some of this work is important. About scales, I just want to echo what Konrad said in the beginning, that I think individual lives and biographies are sort of one way of dealing with this. I come at my own work often with these sort of larger narratives in mind, and then as soon as you follow people, you realize that many of these supposed caesuras either don't make sense, or they don't work quite in the same way that you expect, that obviously people's lives cut across them. So that's, I think, one way of engaging, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, we are rapidly approaching the end of our allotted time, so why don't I get a variety of questions out there and get our panelists to respond. So first, we were talking about memory culture, and there's a couple of questions here about this very high-profile exhibition that should be opening next year, that I think was commissioned by the German Bundestag about World War II and German occupation in Europe. So any thoughts on that? And then finally, we have several questions about East Germany, which has been a specter over this entire kind of conversation. And so to go with one question for a second, do you think that the imperfect integration of Eastern Germany weakened or strengthened the federal public's commitment to European integration? There was another question about the adoption of the euro, which obviously shows more kind of commitment to European integration. So kind of a question about that. And then also to talk about East Germany, Anna, I think you mentioned the fact that there are upcoming elections. This Alternative for Germany is going to do very well there. Does the maybe I won't say failure, but let's say the lack of complete success at the point of German unification and then integrating East Germany, is that an explanation for why the AfD is doing so well there? And then I guess related to that is this new Sarah Wagenknecht party also kind of a consequence of this imperfect integration? Anna, would you like to start maybe?
Yeah, I mean, some of these questions are more political sciencey, I think, than I sort of feel comfortable addressing. But on the point about the AfD and the new Sarah Wagenknecht party, I mean, I certainly think that these issues have more to do with the post-unification era and the faults that were made then than they do with East German history per se. And I think this is precisely the kind of thing that books like the one by Oschmann that I mentioned sort of write against, this sort of version in, you know, some media, some West German commentary, that these authoritarian residues are somehow a hangover from the East German past. And I think it's important to point out that much of this is a result of the process of transformation, some of the things that Konrad talked about. So yes, I do think there's a connection, but it's, you know, it's far more complex than some of these narratives suggest. And then, yeah, I'll stop that.
I'd just like to echo what Anna said. I really myself very much believe, I worked on the GDR in the 1990s and never published the book that I was working on. But I did spend a lot of time thinking about it back then. I was writing a book about the chemical city of Bitterfeld. And when you look at a place like that, what you see is a town that had a lot of problems, to be sure, environmental only being one of them. But on the other hand, right now, you look at it as a place where, with a tremendously skewed age demographic, many of the young people have, you know, already leaving in the 90s in droves, and it's created a kind of a place, an area that, you know, I think that it's the real context of this is globalization and the creation of new zones where societies have to some extent been, I don't want to use the word left behind, but it doesn't look so different to me when I drive out into rural and small town Tennessee, where those towns are also struggling. These small town America struggles the same way, and they have very similar solutions. So I think as we think more and more about why the AfD, why particularly in these areas of Germany, I think that we have to start thinking not so much about the GDR past, and, you know, communist holdovers, all of that. I think we have to start thinking more seriously about the economy, the global economy we live in the way that this also create ravages certain vulnerable areas. And I think that that's what a big part of what we're looking at.
All right, Konrad, some final thoughts from you?
Yeah, some of my East German colleagues would always say, we have already done the neoliberal transition and now it's going to be your turn in the West. So that was, of course, a way of dealing with the difficulty. I think the European integration trajectory and the East German unification trajectory really ran into different directions. They are coterminous in time, and they're in the French case with Mitterrand and Kohl also connected substantively with the international dimension of German unification. But I think the problem with the East German situation is, as my co-panelists have pointed out, that not only do you have a transition from real existing socialism to liberal democracy, but you have this under a neoliberal kind of signum, flag, or whatever. So you have a coincidence of different kinds of major structural changes, and that these then would have psychological consequences, and that there would be disappointments is not really surprising.
All right, well, that brings us to our time. I really want to thank Anna, Helmut, Konrad for taking the time to speak with us and to share your insights on this illustrious 75th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Republic. And let me also thank all of our attendees for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us today. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.